Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're tackling a big one. Why is it that some nations seem to just take off while others, well, they kind of stay stuck?
It's a question with huge implications for everyone, that's for sure.
And our guide today is a book that's gotten some serious buzz, Why Nations Fail, by Daron, Acemoglu and James Robinson.
It's been praised by, Nobel Prize winners, so you know it's got to be good.
We're ditching the usual explanations, like those tired tropes about tropical climates or cultures that just aren't cut out for success.
We're going deeper. It's time to get real.
So let's get into it. What are Acemoglu and Robinson really saying here? It seems like they're tossing out a lot of conventional wisdom.
Absolutely. They're saying, forget geography, forget those cultural stereotypes. It all comes down to institutions. Think of them like a nation's software.
Institutions, okay, like the rules of the game. But what does that even mean?
Exactly. And just like software, there are good versions and, well, not so good versions.
So we're talking extractive versus inclusive, right? I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these two flavors of institutions.
All right, so picture extractive institutions like a rigged game, right?
Hmm?
The powerful elite, they set up the rules to benefit themselves. Monopolies, rigged elections, you name it.
So basically, they're extracting wealth from the majority and keeping it for themselves. Doesn't sound like a recipe for a happy and prosperous nation.
Not exactly. Now, flip that script and you've got inclusive institutions. These are the good guys. Think secure property rights, a level playing field for everyone who wants to start a business, education that's available to everyone, not just the privileged few.
So setting the stage for fair competition and opportunity for all.
Bingo. And this is where it gets really interesting. Acemoglu and Robinson, they argue that geography, culture, even ignorance, they're not destiny.
So you're saying it's not about the hand you're dealt, but how you play it.
Exactly. And they've got a great example of the city of Nogales. It's literally sliced right down the middle.
No girls. Wait, is that the one where one side's in Arizona and the other's in Mexico?
That's the one. Same geography, same cultural background. But the living standards, night and day.
So how do you explain that with just geography or culture? You can't. Okay, I'm convinced. But what determines which path a nation takes, extractive or inclusive?
They call them critical junctures, major turning points like revolutions, plagues, even something like a new technology. Stuff that can really shake things up.
Okay, so like a societal reset button.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
And it creates an opening for profound change. Sometimes good, sometimes not so much.
Give me an example, something concrete to show how this critical juncture thing works.
Well, they talk about the Black Death. Now, obviously that was horrific, but it had surprisingly different consequences depending on where you were.
right, like same plague, very different outcomes.
Exactly. So in Western Europe, where peasants actually had a bit more power to begin with, the Black Death led to the decline of feudalism.
Because suddenly labor was scarce, so workers could demand more rights. Fascinating how something so terrible could actually shift the power dynamics like that.
But in Eastern Europe, it actually had the opposite effect, reinforced the existing power structure, made things even more unequal.
Wow, that's wild. Same plague, two totally different paths, all because of the institutions that were already in place. It's like those choose your own adventure books. A critical juncture pops up and suddenly you're at a fork in the road.
Exactly. And they use this critical juncture idea to explain a lot of other historical divergences too.
Like how North and South America developed so differently.
That's a big one.
They argue that North America, sparsely populated back then, attracted those European settlers who were really looking for a fresh start. They demanded more rights, more inclusive systems.
Right. But South America was already densely populated. You had the Spanish conquistadors waltzing in, focused on extracting wealth, not building a fair society.
So they just took over those pre-existing extractive systems,
Yeah.
using forced labor and all that.
Sadly, yeah. And they argue that the legacy of those early institutions, it's still visible in the Americas today. Crazy, right?
It really makes you wonder if a country gets stuck with those bad institutions early on, are they doomed? Is there any hope?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And thankfully, Acemoglu and Robinson say no nation is stuck forever.
Okay, so there's hope. But how? They're not just saying, wait for another plague or a revolution.
Right? There's a bit more to it than that. That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
So it's not hopeless, but it's not exactly a walk in the park either. If a nation's stuck with those extractive institutions, how do they break free? Is it just a matter of waiting for the right moment, or is there more to it?
Well, the good news is that Acemoglu and Robinson, they don't just leave us hanging. They actually spend a big chunk of the book looking at countries that made that leap from extractive to inclusive.
Okay, so they're not just doom and gloom. There are some success stories. Give me some highlights. What did those countries have in common? How did they pull it off?
Well, for starters, those transitions, they're rarely smooth sailing. It's not like flipping a switch. Think about it. Big shifts like the Glorious Revolution in England, the French Revolution, even something like the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, those were messy, tumultuous processes.
Okay, so buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. But what can those examples teach us? How do we navigate those bumps?
They highlight this idea that you often need like a perfect storm. You need broad coalitions, people from all walks of life coming together demanding change. You need those critical junctures, those moments of upheaval that create an opening for real reform. And of course, you need a good dose of courage to challenge those deeply entrenched power structures.
So, no easy answers, no five-step plan to fix a nation. It sounds more like a constant push for progress, being strategic and ready to seize those opportunities when they arise.
Nailed it. And that's where understanding history becomes so crucial. Because it's not just about dates and names. It's about recognizing those patterns, those recurring themes, so that when those opportunities pop up, we're ready. We've got to be ready to learn from the past, to shape the future.
Like having a roadmap, not just of where we've been, but where we might be headed. Speaking of roadmaps, why nations fail. It's not just about the past, is it? They tackle some pretty big questions about the present and future, too. Like China, for example.
Oh yeah, China's a big one.
Because you've got this economic powerhouse growing like crazy, but still operating under a one-party system. It kind of throws a wrench in that whole argument about needing inclusive institutions, doesn't it?
It does seem that way, doesn't it? But they have an answer for that.
Okay, I'm listening. How do they square that circle? Are they saying China's found some magic formula, some exception to the rule?
Not quite. See, they acknowledge China's growth, it's undeniable, but they argue that it's built on, well, kind of shaky ground.
Shaky ground, how so?
They call it extractive growth. And they say it's not sustainable in the long run. It might look impressive now, but
But it's like building a house on sand. Looks good at first, but can it weather a storm?
that's a great way to put it. Acemoglu and Robinson, they argue that without those inclusive institutions, without those checks and balances, the open flow of information, the freedom to disagree, China's growth is vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what exactly?
Corruption, instability, and ultimately stagnation. They're saying those inclusive institutions, they're not just some nice to have, they're essential for long-term success.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it, for anyone who thinks they can just skip over those inclusive foundations. So it's not just about achieving growth, it's about what kind of growth, right?
Exactly. And they point to other examples too, not just China. Places like North Korea, Zimbabwe, Uzbekistan countries that might seem worlds apart, but when you look closer, they share a common thread.
So, what's the common thread? What are the red flags we should be looking out for? Because it's not always as in your face as a dictator, right? Sometimes these extractive forces, they're more subtle.
You're right, they can be sneaky. It usually boils down to power concentrated in the hands of a select few. A single party, a dictator, an elite group calling all the shots.
Yeah.
You see things like dissent being shut down, control over what information people have access to, often a good dose of fear or violence to keep everyone in line.
So a toxic mix of political repression and economic exploitation, all designed to benefit those in control. And you're right, it's not always as blatant as a dictator with an iron fist. Acemoglu and Robinson, they talk about things like the slow erosion of democratic norms, right?
Yeah, they do.
It's those subtle things like corruption slowly creeping in, how special interests can hijack regulatory agencies, even just little ways to tilt the scales in an electoral system. Those things might seem small, but over time,
They add up.
exactly. It's like a slow leak in a tire. Might not notice it at first, but eventually you're going to have a flat. So we need to be wary of those seemingly small compromises, those moments where we look the other way when something feels a bit off. Because those can be the cracks that extractive forces exploit, right?
They'd be very good at exploiting those cracks, unfortunately.
Why nations fail. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What stood out to you as particularly important or surprising? What were some of your big takeaways?
Honestly, the thing that really struck me was this emphasis on contingency, how history isn't just this straight line of progress, but it's a series of forks in the road with chance events and the decisions of individuals playing a surprisingly big role.
Right, like one battle goes differently, one leader makes a different call, and who knows how things turn out. It's like those choose your own adventure books we were talking about earlier, but on a global scale. So The world as we know it, it's not the only possible outcome, is it? There were so many points where it could have gone in a totally different direction.
Exactly. They have this example of the English Civil War. They say, imagine if just one battle had gone the other way. Who knows what would happen to England? Or to the rest of the world, for that matter. It really makes you think.
It does. Makes you realize how much of history comes down to these seemingly small moments that can have these huge ripple effects. What else resonated with you?
Their discussion of broad coalitions really got me thinking. The idea that lasting change, real change, it rarely comes from just one heroic individual. It's about ordinary people, people from all walks of life, coming together and demanding something better.
It's about finding that common ground, right? Even when there are differences. It's those moments when enough people say enough is enough, and they find the courage to stand together, like the civil rights movement, for example.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that even in the face of what seem like impossible odds, collective action can make a difference. Those moments give me hope.
Me too.
Hmm.
But it can feel daunting sometimes, right? Like, how can we as individuals even begin to make a dent in these massive systemic issues? How do we apply that lesson to our own lives?
That's a question for the ages, isn't it?
Mhm.
And thankfully, it's something we're going to dig into in the final part of our deep dive.
So we've seen how some nations have managed to break free from those extractive institutions, those systems that just seem to keep everyone stuck. But what's the secret sauce? How do we actually make that happen?
Right. It's not enough to just sit around and hope for the best or wait for some magical critical juncture to fall into our laps.
Yeah.
We've got to be proactive, right?
Exactly. So how do we do that? What are some concrete steps we can take to tip the scales toward a more inclusive future, starting today?
Well, remember how we were talking about education? That's a huge piece of the puzzle.
It all starts with education. Sounds
Mm.
kind of cliche, doesn't it?
Maybe. But there's a reason it comes up again and again, right? It's about empowering people with knowledge. When you think about it, education gives people the tools they need to think critically, to see through all the noise and propaganda, to demand better from their leaders.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures, it's about learning how to think for yourself, how to question the status quo.
Exactly. It's about equipping people to be informed, engaged citizens. And it's not just about formal education either.
Mhm.
There are so many ways to support this: volunteering at a local school, mentoring a student, just speaking up in your community about the need for better educational resources. Every little bit helps.
It's about investing in human potential, which ultimately benefits everyone, right? Okay, so education's key. What else can we do to be part of the solution?
Well, it starts with ourselves, right? We have to be informed citizens too.
So, doing our homework.
Exactly. Staying informed about current events is important, but it's not enough to just skim the headlines. We have to dig deeper, question those narratives, be willing to consider different perspectives, even when they make us uncomfortable.
It's easy to stay in our echo chambers, surrounded by people who already agree with us. But that's not how real change happens, is it?
Nope. Real change requires getting uncomfortable sometimes. It requires listening to those who have different experiences, different viewpoints. It's about being open to having those tough conversations, challenging our own biases, and maybe even changing our minds.
It's about recognizing that none of us has all the answers.
Exactly. We have to
Yeah.
be humble, willing to learn from each other. And that ties into another important point: supporting organizations that are already doing the work on the ground.
So finding those groups, those NGOs, those think tanks, those grassroots movements that are fighting for those inclusive institutions we've been talking about.
Exactly. There are so many amazing people and organizations out there doing incredible work, often with very little recognition or support. And we need to have their backs.
But it can feel overwhelming sometimes, right? Like with so many worthy causes, where do you even start? Any tips for listeners who want to find those organizations that resonate with their values?
Follow your passions. What are you most passionate about? What issues keep you up at night?
What gets you fired up?
Exactly. If you're concerned about economic inequality, look for organizations fighting for workers' rights, promoting financial literacy. If you're passionate about environmental sustainability, support groups that are working to protect our planet.
So find those causes that light your fire and dive in. It's not about doing everything. It's about finding your niche and making a difference in whatever way you can.
Exactly. Because every little bit helps. Even small actions can have a ripple effect. It's not always about those big, grand gestures. It's about the everyday choices we make, too.
Okay, so bring it down to earth for me. What kind of everyday choices are we talking about? Give me some concrete examples.
Well, let's talk about where you spend your money, for example.
Okay, I'm listening.
Are you supporting businesses that exploit their workers, that pollute the environment? Or are you choosing to invest in companies with ethical business practices, companies that prioritize sustainability?
So it's about voting with our wallets, being conscious consumers, supporting businesses that align with our values.
Exactly. It's about aligning our actions with our beliefs in all areas of our lives. It's about the information we consume too, right?
You mean what we read, what we watch, what we listen to?
Exactly. Are we getting our news from sources that reinforce our existing biases? Or are we actively seeking out diverse viewpoints, challenging those assumptions?
Being critical thinkers.
Yes, because it's so easy to get stuck in those echo chambers, to surround ourselves with information that just confirms what we already believe. But if we want to be part of creating a more inclusive world, we have to be willing to step outside of those comfort zones.
It's about recognizing that our own perspective is just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Okay, so we're being mindful consumers, both with our money and with our information. What else?
This might be the most important one. We have to talk about these issues.
Speaking up.
Yes, having those conversations with our friends, our families, our communities, because the more we talk about these things, the more we raise awareness, the more we normalize the idea that we can actually create a better future.
Because silence only benefits the status quo.
Exactly. We can't be afraid to speak up, to challenge injustice, to use our voices to advocate for change. We have to be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable. And that's what Why Nations Fail really drives home, that these conversations, these individual acts of courage and conscious choice-making, they matter.
And they can spark bigger movements.
Exactly. It creates that ripple effect. It shifts mindsets, builds momentum, and ultimately it helps to create a world where those critical junctures, those moments of opportunity, they lead to more inclusive outcomes.
It's a powerful message, isn't it? This idea that we're not just passive bystanders in this story. We have agency. We have a choice. And those choices, both big and small, they have the power to shape the future.
We have more power than we realize sometimes.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, and I hope it's left our listeners with a lot to think about and, more importantly, a lot to do. If you're ready to take that next step, be sure to check out Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. It's a dense read in places, but it will really make you think differently about the world and about your place in it.
It's a game changer for sure.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions. Keep pushing for a better future, and remember, you have the power to make a difference.